Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. I'm going to go today in a direction that I'm pretty comfortable with, and I'll take you along for a ride here a little bit on something that I think is vital, and that is understanding the role of science, uh, evolution, nature, and the Bible, and how these work together. Einstein famously said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And this is a topic that I'm comfortable with because as I've done my studies, some of you may know this, is that I studied to be an engineer. I was a chemical engineer. And I did that for a career for a long time. And some of the things that I'll tell you a little story about what I learned in that, where it kind of took me. But I think the thing that is most interesting that I got out of that, and only has become much clearer to me later in life, is the studies I did in thermodynamics, in particular, taught me a lot about randomness and taught me a lot about what that means and what we call the stochastic nature of the universe. So stochastic is just a fancy way of saying things that are all things are probabilistic, all things have randomness in them, that there's always variation in every process, and that it's not just something of an imperfect way, but it's just the way nature works. Way nature always has variation, always has uncertainty built into it, and that makes us, especially Americans, who are certainty addicts, very uncomfortable. So this is behind a lot of our faith, and particularly when it comes to inerrancy of the Bible, creation myth, a literal interpretation of creation in Genesis, and how we go through that. So what I'd like to do is kind of walk through in as simple of a way as I can, but not too simple. And hopefully, by coming along on the ride with me, you can kind of get a little bit bigger picture. The other thing I want to touch on too is someday, it may be in our lifetimes, it may, but I'm pretty certain it's going to happen at some point in the future, is that we're going to have strong evidence of life on Mars or the moon Europa that goes around Jupiter, or Enceladus, which is a moon that goes around Saturn. There are many, many compelling reasons why we'll probably discover evidence of life on those, on one or more of those. It's just too compelling to not believe that we would see life, or that life may even be commonplace in the universe, besides Earth. And that presents a major theological challenge for us because we think we're special, right? We think we're the center of the universe. We always have, and that our God is the God of the universe. So um, I think in dealing with that and dealing with uncertainty, dealing with what science tells us in a truthful way can really help us, because someday we're going to have to deal with it again, and new doors are going to open up. I'm excited about that because I'm always excited when we learn new stuff that challenges our thoughts and feelings. So I'll start with a little story of mine. When I was a sophomore in college in the early 1980s, and I was a chemical engineering major. I was studying like mad to make that work. I took the dreaded class that every chemical engineer makes, and that is chemical engineering thermodynamics. It's a bit like if you are an accountant or an economist. Econometrics is one of those kind of weeder classes. It's really tough. If you're a musician, taking advanced music theory can be that way. I even looked up something. I have a friend a former friend of mine who passed away, unfortunately, but he was a welder, and he was an expert welder. And he had to learn this thing called, I don't know, tungsten something or other, welding. It was extremely hard. He had to go to classes for it. And it's just reminded me that no matter what field you're in, everybody's got that big, scary mountain to climb in one. So, as a chemical engineering student, I had to go through um, a special kind of thermodynamics that chemical engineers have to go through, multi-component thermodynamics, which is quite a bit harder than the sort of thermodynamics that you may have encountered in, say, freshman chemistry or have heard about. And it's tough. So our my uh, course was taught by this professor. His name was Dr. Chang, and he was from Taiwan, and he was well known to be a tough teacher. He was a very cheerful man, and he was, it was kind of fun to go to his classes and stuff. But boy, he went fast. He had difficult exams. He graded tough. It was a tough, tough class. And the thing that was always fun about him is when he started a lecture, he would say, um, in his Taiwan accent, he would say, "Oh, very simple. This is very simple. Just like high school. Yeah, no problem. You get it. Just like high school, right?" He would say that, and then he would proceed after saying that to fill chalkboard after chalkboard with partial differential equations, which is kind of the language of thermodynamics. And he would fill it, and people would say, "Oh, Dr. Chang," ask questions as you went through it. But then as soon as he answered the question, he would just keep going. So after he filled three chalkboards full of equations, he'd go to the end and he'd say, "See, I told you, very simple, just like high school." So it reminded me a little bit of what Einstein said. We should make everything as simple, but not too simple. But it was kind of a joke among the students because we admired him. But the thing about it was that anybody who went through that class and kept up as much as they could and learned, they learned a lot. They really learned multi-component thermodynamics well, and so he was a great teacher in that respect. The reason why I bring this up is because in that class, 40 something years ago for me, I there was a seed planted. I learned something that would last and that I would grow from and that would tell me a lot about faith. And in a sermon, I said, it's not the kind of lesson you would expect, like praying before an exam or something like that. No, it's actually a technical thing. So let me explain this in a simple Einsteiny way, Occam's razor kind of way possible, and maybe maybe you'll be able to follow me with this. The idea is that we have all heard about the concept of entropy, and entropy is just simply a measure of disorder. So something that has a lot of entropy is highly disordered. Something that has low in entropy is highly ordered or complex. And we also have learned that everything in the universe tends toward higher entropy, that the universe increases in entropy overall, and that things tend toward disorder. And a simple way to think of this is if I have a stack of coins that I've stacked on top of each other, say 100 coins on the desk here, and that is at a lower entropy state than if I whack it with my hand and fling the coins all over the floor around in the room. That is a higher entropy state for those coins, for that system. Um, the thing that people don't think about is the fact that entropy is in a closed system decreases when you put energy into it, when you use energy to make it less disordered. You can use energy to decrease entropy. Again, if I take the coins, is that I can go around the room, I can gather up the coins and I can restack them. Now, those coins won't stack themselves. Um, it's there, there's an infinitesimally small probability that they could by themselves, but it's so infinitesimally small there's no way that in practical experience it's going that, these coins are going to stack themselves. So I have to go and expend energy in order to restack the coins. So I can do that. Now these are pretty, you can follow that's pretty simple, right? Is that you can, yes, things tend toward disorder, but you can expend energy in order to create complexity and decrease disorder or order things by basically uh, expending energy, flinging that entropy off into the environment or into something else in order to get order. The reason why this is so important is because that's what biological systems do constantly. Um, as your body is a machine that takes in energy or takes in food, converts it into energy. And if you look at the biochemistry, everything, it's constantly taking energy and then it's using that energy to decrease the disorder or to increase the complexity of things like proteins and other molecules and these complex molecules. And you need that in order to grow. And once you are fully grown, you still need that for repair, for healing, or for the building of processes in your body. And you have to always do this. It's, stasis is decay. You're going to decay naturally. And what makes it interesting is that's like any process in in the universe. That's like any physical process requires energy to maintain. Otherwise, it'll tend to decay. Um, this is something that's so basic, and it makes perfect sense when you look at it from the biochemical point of view. You can go, and maybe I'll go a little deeper here. There's this concept of free energy of formation. And this is something that chemists, and especially biochemists, because it happens in biological processes all the time, and that is that you want to go toward lower energy systems because that's where you get equilibrium. That's where you when you reduce the energy of a system, you'll tend toward that. Well, what free energy of formation does is when you decrease the overall free energy or the energy of the system by this what's called Gibbs energy or free energy of formation, you're basically exchanging the increase of entropy of another system or something outside of the system in order to decrease the entropy within the system. Now that's really technical, and I don't know if I explained it real well, but the idea is that that's how you get more complex things. That's how you get growth. That's how you get repair. That's how you maintain your house. That's how you maintain your car. That's how you maintain everything, is that you expend energy in order to increase or to increase the order, decrease the entropy within the system that you're working on. It sounds highly technical, but if you stand back for a moment, you realize it makes perfect sense because you do it all the time, and your body does it all the time. This is one of the main arguments. So I'll go two different directions with this. One is about faith. One is about creation and creation science. They call it creationists talk about. Maybe I'll start with faith. The thing is that one must have faith because nothing is certain. Because the underlying aspect of entropy is something called statistical mechanics, which relies on randomness, relies on probability. Everything is stochastic. In other words, everything has variation in it, as I mentioned before. In other words, the system won't work unless you have randomness. You can't do this process of decreasing the entropy of something in a system without the randomness that's associated with it. And that's a very uncomfortable thing for people to deal with because they think that randomness is a bad thing. But it's actually the randomness, the ability to have this transfer of entropy that allows us to do things like to grow, to have more complex systems. You can't do one without the other. Um, so if I talk about faith for a second, is that since nothing is certain, since there is always this stochastic element in everything, in all of the universe, um, we have to predict, we have to put our faith into things in order to invest the energy that we need to do something. Does that make sense? The idea is that we have to make an investment of energy to improve anything. Um, just like the body does, just like any physical process does, in order to make something more complex, in order to repair or heal or grow, you need to expend that energy. You need to make an investment. Now, in chemistry, that investment is the transfer of free energy of formation. And in when we do things consciously to bring things to more order, we make an investment of our own personal energy, right? Our biological systems make an investment in order to increase complexity or to reduce disorder. It's just the way the world works. So now moving from faith, so I think that faith is an integral part of reality, that you have to have faith in you have to have a motivation in order to spend that energy. That motivation is faith. Um, and for me, that's where sort of the need for God comes from in people, is that they have to have that hope, that faith in order to expend the energy. For me, that makes sense. Where it creates a problem for a lot of people of faith is that, especially we in the West, especially in America, we are addicts of certainty. We're certainty addicts, right? So we want to have everything locked down. We don't like that faithy stuff. We say we do, but we really don't. We don't like uncertainty. It drives us nuts. We hate it. And this is what gets behind the idea of creationism, is you can't stand, if you can't stand that uncertainty, then you're going to grasp onto something that you want to feel certain about, and that would be, in the case of fundamentalist or conservative Christians, especially fundamentalist Christians, creationism. The idea that the Bible is something I can grab onto, that God is immutable, He doesn't change, He's perfect, He controls everything, He's on top of everything, He does everything, and if it gives me something to hang on to, because I hate the fact that reality is so uncertain. This is I think, the intellectual basis for creationism, so that with the overwhelming evidence that we have today, uh, nearly 2 centuries of Darwin, plus the fact that, nearly, 5 centuries of heliocentric universe, or that the Earth isn't in the center, that the sun is, of the solar system, the 100 years of understanding that the universe is way larger, the 150 years of understanding that the stochastic nature and the quantum nature of physics, the beginnings of that at least, and that chaos and random systems. With all of that, we know that, from a scientific point of view, from a analytical point of view, that creationism makes no sense whatsoever. And that creation science, which they put the word science on it, is really nonsense, because you quickly realize that um, you can't that it's really a matter of debating something that you can't verify or touch or support with evidence. It's really an ideology. It's not a science, right? Um, And it's kind of pointless to make those arguments. And whenever you get into an argument with a creationist who's really committed, you're not going to win because you're not on the same playing field. They're on the playing field of ideology, and if you're on the playing field of reality and science, then you're not going to you're not going to cross over. They may they may talk your language, or you may try to talk their language, and you're not going to be able to do it. Um, so this is why, in my view, the faithful use of Scripture, it's so important to not take the path of the fundamentalist, and that is to deny what's right in front of your eyes, that you can verify, that you can touch, that you have evidence for, in order to uphold your ideology. That's essentially what fundamentalism is. To uphold the ideology of biblical inerrancy, you have to deny the preponderance of evidence that's behind things like evolution, that's behind things uh, um, chaos and quantum mechanics and all these other things, is that randomness is built into the system. Randomness is not the enemy. And that's what's often put in front of us, is that's a big part of the arguments that, well, okay, if humans came from apes, then why are there still apes? Well, that makes no sense whatsoever. There are many times when uh, species coexist. Um, Even in human species, we know of at least three, and there are probably many more, three different species of humans. And we know today that each of us has a tiny bit. If you're 100% from Africa, you may have almost none. But if you're from Europe or Asia, each of us has a small fraction between 1 and 3% of DNA that comes from Neanderthals. And you go, well, but how's that possible? And Neanderthals aren't around today. Well, but they did coexist, the species of humans, and the Denisovians in Asia were likely too, and we probably have Denisovian DNA in us as well. But you go, well, how is that possible? Well, because that's the way species work. We know this is true because um, a small, uh, the cap of uh, Neanderthal DNA in us seems to be around 3%. The people with the highest amount of DNA is a roughly 3%. And the best explanation for that is that when you do have interspecies breeding, that usually, most often, not always, but usually the offspring is sterile. We know this because of mules, right? Mules are horses and donkeys, and horses and donkeys, when they breed, create perfectly fine animals, mules. But mules are almost completely always sterile. Um, and because when you take two different species and they interbreed, they don't create offspring that can perpetuate. Same thing with ligers. If you've heard of that, lions and tigers can actually breed and create an interspecies, but ligers are always sterile. That was true for humans too. So that's how that happens. Speciation happens all the time. When you have enough adaptations adding up, then you create something that can't interbreed anymore. That, by definition, by our definition in biology, is a different species. This is this is probably the main argument that creationists have, saying that, well, of course there's adaptation, and now we have genetics, we know there's adaptation, right? But it never creates new species, right? That's macroevolution, and there's all kinds of examples of where macroevolution can occur. That's nonsense. Macroevolution, first of all, that's not a real term. The real term is speciation. Happens all the time. That there's enough variation, there's enough over long periods of time that new species are formed. So, but again, if I'm arguing that with a creation person, creationist, they're just not going to get it. They're not going to care, uh, because they're too much uh, wedded to their ideology instead of the science. And the basis for all of this is that randomness, is they can't stand the fact that there's randomness, there's probability in every system. That's just part of it. You can even argue, does how does God fit into that? Is God this perfect and immutable being, or is God part of that? I don't know. But the thing is that you can't separate reality and well, you can, but you shouldn't um, uh, shun reality in favor of ideology. That just leads to bad things. So that gets you to that next step then. What are we going to do about this? Um, First of all, is how do you use scripture? How do you believe in God? I believe in integration. I've talked about that in previous podcasts where I'm talking about how I mentioned Buddhism and some of the ideas there is that we always have to integrate. We always have to integrate mind and body, the inside and the outside. We have to integrate what we observe with what our theology is and what our beliefs are. So we always have this job. We have to expend energy to make water out of this, right? And that's what we're doing with that. So I believe that's how what a faithful use of scripture is, a faithful use of religion is this idea of having an integrated faith that makes sense. Of course, you can reject it altogether, or you can reject trying to integrate and just stay dissociated. But I don't think that's healthy for either party because everyone has a certain amount of faith in life. Everyone has a certain amount of reality they have to contend with in life. So finally, will talk a little bit about uh, what if we see life showing up elsewhere in the universe? Um, just from a probability point of view and what we know about, especially in the last several decades or so, when we've learned that life doesn't need sunshine, doesn't need oxygen in order to exist, that life in thermal vents in the bottom of the ocean, where all they have is an energy source, organic organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry working together, and you have life. We don't know how that life, the origin or how that was created, but certainly it was in the bottom of the ocean. It was likely created independently of in other places. Now you can argue whether that's true or false, but if we do find um, evidence of life in um, Mars, it looks like there's some um, recent data that shows small um, rock formations that looks like they could have only been created biologically, and because the thermal processes weren't sufficient to be able to do that. At least that's what the theory is. So maybe that's an early indication of life on Mars. The conditions were certainly there several billion years ago. You know, you had a mild climate, you had plenty of water, and you had atmosphere um, and organic compounds. So maybe that happened. Uh, but you could also make an argument, oh, well, Mars is maybe close enough and we could share, I don't, who knows? When you get to some place like Europa or Enceladus, which have oceans underneath their caps, their ice caps, and there's plenty of energy down there. We now know because we've flown spacecraft through them that there are organic molecules there. Um, if we do find um, if we do find evidence of life in those places or on Titan within our own solar system, and here we are, we're one solar system, out of what, 100 billion of them in the Milky Way, out of a trillion galaxies out there. um, if we find another example of life, even within our own solar system, then you got to ask, and it's far enough away that it's completely independent. You've got to ask the question, What makes us special? It's like the next step in this idea of moving away from, geocentric to heliocentric universe, to um, the laws of motion, to randomness in biology, which we call evolution, to randomness elsewhere. And you got to say, well, okay, if those processes work independently there, then what does that mean? What does that mean for our faith? Does that destroy our faith? And saying, well, our faith is ridiculous? Well, I don't think so. What if I had a professor that once said this too, a seminary professor. He goes, well, what if if there are beings more than 2,000 light years away from Earth, and there are intelligent beings like humans out there somewhere? And if we believe that, uh, you know, Jesus Christ saves all of us, well, what about them? They they're more than they're more than 2,000 light years away, And he just asked that question as sort of a hypothetical, and just saying, well, you have to kind of rethink where we stand and what our theologies are, and we have to we have to kind of modify them as we get new data and new understanding of the universe. Well, I mean, I guess I'm not that uncomfortable with the idea. I don't know exactly how God works or what God is or anything like that. I know that I have a relationship with God, but, an intelligent being somewhere else in the universe, um, I don't know what that does. And I'm okay with that because I'm uncertain about it. There's no way to know. And so within our lifetime, we may get that first glimpse in seeing that by having a verifiable or extremely, strong evidence that there is life elsewhere. How are we going to deal with that? So instead of being afraid of it, let's just stand back in the wonder of it. And that's the way I look at all of these things in the science that we have learned, in the stochastic nature of the universe, in the randomness that's behind things like entropy and biological processes. Let's just stand back. I stand back in awe of it and stop trying to pin it down into something. Stop trying to force it into an ancient manuscript that wasn't developed for that purpose, you know, 2,600 years ago, which is when these stories were written. And they were, the book of Genesis contains so many stories that were written down 1,000 years before it was compiled into Genesis, because they were doing the same thing we're doing back then. They were trying to figure out, where are they in the universe, who God is, and why did God create us and how God created us. They were trying to figure that out 2,600 years ago, and we're still trying to figure it out today. So that's how I look at evolution, nature, and the Bible, and how they work together in faith. So people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there, especially when they try to use it as a science book to understand everything, instead of having it be just one of the ways that we learn about ourselves, about humanity, and our relationship with God and who God is. And with that, I say thank you for listening, and God bless you.